My father-in-law laughed at me across the boardroom table, loud enough that the lawyers near the windows turned to look, and he told everyone I was just a small-town girl who'd married up and gotten lost. He said I couldn't even read a balance sheet without my husband holding my hand. I sat alone at the far end of that long walnut table in a coat I'd bought on clearance at Winners, and I let him laugh. Then the chair of the acquiring company set down her pen, looked at the brooch on my lapel, and went pale. Hold on, she said quietly. That's the Cedar Hollow mark. Here. My husband stopped smirking. The color drained right out of his face. My name is Tamsin, and I'm 31. For the last 4 years, I've quietly bought up distressed companies across Ontario and the Maritimes through a holding firm nobody can trace back to me. In the rooms where it matters, they call me the closer because I buy the debt that's drowning a business and then I decide whether it lives or dies. But to the Whitfields, the family I married into, I was the nobody from a fishing town in Nova Scotia who got lucky and ought to be grateful every single day for the privilege. Before I tell you exactly how I let and dismantle themselves while I sat back with a coffee, tell me in the comments which province or country you're watching from. And if you believe the best revenge is the quiet kind, the kind with receipts, hit that like button and stay with me, because this one is worth it. It started at the cottage. Not a cottage, really. The Whitfields called everything a cottage, the way some people call a 40-foot boat a dinghy. This was a 6-bedroom timber frame place on Lake Joseph in Muskoka, the kind of property where the neighbors are bankers and former cabinet ministers. My mother-in-law, Bernadette, threw a party there every August long weekend, and that year it was meant to celebrate my husband Royce's promotion to vice president of the family firm. Whitfield Marine Holdings, boats, marinas, a chain of dealerships from Kingston to Halifax. Old money by Canadian standards, which is to say 3 generations, and a lot of pretending the 4th generation earned any of it. I drove up alone in my 8-year-old Corolla. Royce had gone ahead in the Range Rover with his sister. When I pulled into the long gravel drive, past the row of imported SUVs and a vintage Reaver runabout tied up at the dock, I could already hear the string trio they'd hired playing on the deck. I was wearing a plain navy dress and flats. I looked like the help, and I knew it, and that was exactly the point. I'd barely stepped onto the flagstone path when Royce's sister, Corolla, came gliding toward me with a glass of red in her hand. Corolla was the kind of beautiful that made strangers apologize for existing in her presence, and she'd decided the day Royce brought me home that I was a stain on the family name. She smiled wide, said how lovely it was that I'd made the drive in that little car of yours, and then, mid-sentence, she stepped sideways into nothing at all and emptied the entire glass of Cabernet down the front of my dress. The deck went quiet. The trio kept playing. Coley pressed a hand to her mouth and gasped, theatrical as anything, and said, "Oh no, how clumsy," in a voice pitched for the back row. Then she leaned in close, where only I could hear, and her perfume sat thick in the back of my throat. "Don't worry," she whispered. "I know that dress was the most you could afford. Just try not to drip on the cedar. It's reclaimed barn board from 1890. I didn't flinch. I looked down at the wine spreading dark across the navy, and then I looked back up at her, and I smiled. That smile unsettled her more than tears ever would have. Before she could recover, the screen door of the great room banged open and my father-in-law came out onto the deck. Gerald Whitfield was 70 and built like a man who'd never once been told no. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't even look at the wine. He crossed the deck with a thick brown envelope in his fist, and in front of everyone he threw it at me. It caught me on the collarbone and burst open. A small blizzard of paper scattered across the flagstones, legal documents skidding to a stop against the planters. "Consider that a welcome to the family," finally Gerald said, his voice carrying out over the lake. "It's a claim, Tamsin. We are seeking $3 million. You took client account files when you did our books 8 years ago, and now you're going to answer for it. 8 years ago, I'd been a temp doing data entry for Whitfield Marine for $14 an hour while I finished my accounting designation at night. I'd taken nothing. But the truth was never the point with Gerald. This was punishment, plain and simple, and I knew exactly what for. 3 years earlier, I'd refused to sign over a piece of waterfront land my late grandfather left me, a scrubby 10-acre lot on the Brasdor Lake that Gerald wanted for a marina expansion. He'd offered me a fraction of its worth and called it generous. When I said no, he stopped speaking to me at family dinners and started referring to me, to my face, as Royce's little mistake. You thought you could say no to this family, Gerald said, stepping close enough that I could smell the scotch. You thought your scrap of rock back east made you somebody. You're going to spend the rest of your life paying this off, and you do it knowing you brought it on yourself. You were always going to amount to nothing. I looked around the deck. 40-odd people, half of them I recognized from the society pages, all of them watching like it was theater. Royce stood by the bar with a beer in his hand, not moving. My own husband, he found something very interesting to look at down by the boathouse. Collie had her arms folded, chin up, drinking it in. Not one person stepped toward me. Pick them up, Gerald said. He nodded to the two men he'd hired to park cars and tend bar. Mika. One of them came over, looking embarrassed, and put a hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it pressed me down until I was on my knees on the cold flagstone, gathering wet pages out of the spilled wine while 40 people watched, and a few of them laughed. Bernadette laughed. My mother-in-law actually laughed. They thought they'd broken me. They thought I was a frightened girl in a stained dress on her knees in front of the people who mattered. What they could not have imagined, what would have stopped Daryl's heart right there on the deck, was that the woman kneeling in the wine already held the paper on every dollar of debt Whitfield Marine had taken on in the last 2 years. I owned the rope around their necks. I just hadn't pulled it yet. I gathered the last of the pages and stood. Before I could say anything, Bernadette's hand closed around my elbow, her rings biting into my skin, and she steered me off the deck, through the great room, and into the enormous chef's kitchen, away from the eyes of her friends. The door swung shut and cut off the trio mid-note. I expected a lecture about embarrassing them. What I got was a folded document, pulled from her handbag and laid flat on the marble island. Sign it, Tamsin, she said, dropping her voice to a low, urgent thing. Sign the acknowledgement, and we can make all of this go away tonight. No trial, no fuss. It was a confession, a formal admission that I had stolen and that I owed the 3 million. You want me to confess to something I didn't do, I said, keeping my voice flat and calm. Bernadette sighed like I was being a child. Don't be theatrical. Nobody's going to prison. Gerald's taking the company onto the TSX in the spring. The auditors found gaps, money that doesn't reconcile, quite a lot of it. The underwriters need clean books, and the simplest way to clean them is to attach the shortfall to a former bookkeeper who left under a cloud. You. And there it was. The missing money wasn't an error. It was Royce. My husband, the brand new vice president, the golden boy. He'd been bleeding the company, and they needed someone to take the fall before the IPO so the regulators wouldn't look too hard. You're covering for Royce, I said. He took it, and you want me to wear it so his name stays clean. Bernadette didn't even blink. Royce is the future of this firm. He has a position, a marriage, a name to protect. You have a rented condo and a job pushing other people's numbers around. Do this for your husband. It's the least you owe us for everything we've put up with. Royce was always worth 10 of you. Now sign. She held out a heavy gold pen. I looked at it, and I looked at the confession, and I looked at the woman who'd laughed while I knelt in the wine. I'm not signing anything, I said. I won't pay for Royce's mess, and I won't save a company built on lies. The kitchen door banged open. Gerald had been listening in the hall. His face was a deep, dangerous red. I told you she'd never go along with it, he said to Bernadette, snatching the unsigned paper off the marble. Stubborn, useless, exactly like she's always been. Then he pulled out his phone, eyes locked on mine so I'd be sure to watch him do it. Years before, when Royce and I got married, Gerald had insisted on setting up a joint household account to help us get on our feet and made me a co-holder with him as guarantor. I'd never closed it. I kept $400 in it and used the card to tip valets and pay for parking. To Gerald, that account was my whole financial life. Yes, it's Gerald Whitfield, he said into the phone, watching my face. I need an urgent freeze. There's suspected fraud on a linked account. Tamsin Whitfield. Freeze everything connected to her tonight. He hung up, satisfied. You're cut off. Your cards will decline tonight. You can't pay your rent. You can't buy a coffee. You'll come back here and sign by Monday, or you'll be sleeping in that little car of yours. I adjusted my wine-soaked dress. If that's everything I said, I'll head out. Not yet. He put out his hand, palm up. The keys. The Corolla's leased through the company books. You don't work for us and you're not family, so you've no right to it. Give them here or I'll report it stolen tonight. Outside the kitchen window, the August sky had turned the color of a bruise. A storm had been rolling up the lake all afternoon, and now it broke, rain sheeting against the glass, thunder rattling the cottage windows in their flames. He was going to strand me on a dark Muskoka road, an hour from the nearest town, with no car and no money. He wanted to break my body since he couldn't break my will. I could have told him the lease payments came out of my own account. I could have argued, but arguing with a frightened, arrogant man is a waste of air. I reached into my bag, found the keys, and dropped them on the tile at his feet, the way he dropped the envelope on me. Keep it, I said. I won't be needing it. I pushed past him, shouldered open the back door, and stepped into the rain. It came down so hard it soaked through to my skin in seconds, washing the wine out of the navy fabric in pink rivulets. The door slammed behind me. I walked down the long gravel drive in the dark, lightning cracking over the lake. And I did not cry. Every drop on my face came from the sky. By the time I reached the road, soaked through and shivering, the only thing burning in me was a clean, patient cold. The game was finally properly on. The Whitfields knew the broke version of me, the one who drove the Corolla and clipped grocery coupons and never quite looked comfortable at their dinners. They knew her because I built her carefully over years. The little firm they thought I worked for did boring tax returns for laundromats and Tim Hortons franchisees. My real work, the thing that paid for a life they could not have begun to imagine, lived behind a numbered holding company registered out of Halifax with offshore custody accounts they could never have found, let alone touched. So when I walked back into a deliberately shabby little office 2 days later, in a cheap cardigan with my hair pulled into a tired bun, I knew exactly who was coming. Arrogant people are predictable, and the Whitfields were nothing if not predictable. The glass door didn't open so much as get shoved off its track. Royce came in first, chest out, flanked by two uniformed OPP officers. Coralie clicked in behind him on heels that did not belong on a linoleum floor, a designer scarf pressed to her nose like the air might be catching. Executed, Royce told the officers, sliding a thick legal order across my desk. Theft of corporate property. My father filed this morning. We're taking your hard drives, your files, every scrap. You're done, Tamsin. The officers, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, started unplugging the cheap towers and dropping them into evidence bins. I didn't move. I sat in my squeaky chair and took a sip of truly terrible coffee and let them. Those drives held nothing but dummy ledgers and made up payroll for clients who didn't exist. My actual life sat encrypted on servers no warrant in Ontario could reach. Royce wasn't satisfied with the search. He wanted me to feel it. He swept a stack of file boxes off the shelf, papers fanning across the floor, kicked a recycling bin into the wall. You thought you could blackmail us, he said, leaning over the desk till his face was right in mine. You thought walking out into the rain made you some kind of saint. You're a thief and a nobody, and by the time our lawyers are done, you won't get hired to do the books at a car wash. Coralie drifted forward, her enormous ring catching the fluorescent light, and looked around my office like it was a crime scene. Look at this sad little hole, she said, and dropped a pen of mine into the bin with 2 fingers. You actually thought you could swim with the big fish? She laid a hand on Royce's chest, proud as a cat. While you were stealing files to shake down your own family, my brother was out saving the company. He closed it an hour ago. 50 million in fresh capital from a private fund. Some faceless Eastern outfit that saw his genius and bought out our entire debt in a single stroke. We're untouchable now. The company goes public in the spring, and you go to prison. 50 million in fresh capital. She said it glowing with borrowed pride, certain her husband had charmed a room of titans into rescuing them. She had no idea Royce had walked into a slaughterhouse, handed over the knife, and thanked the man holding it for the favor. The officers carried the last worthless tower out to the cruiser. Royce pointed a finger at my face. Don't run. Your passport's flagged. Your accounts are frozen. I'll see you in court. He turned on his heel and walked out. Coralie gave me a little mocking wave from the broken doorway before stepping back into the sun. I sat very still in my cheap chair and listened to the cruisers pull away. Then I let myself smile, because the faceless Eastern fund that had just swallowed Whitfield Marine's 50 million in debt was mine. The condition I'd attached to that capital injection, buried in 11 pages of terms no one in that family had bothered to read, gave my holding company the right to call the entire balance due, in full, on any confirmed instance of internal financial misconduct. And Royce had been writing his own confession into the company ledgers for 2 years. I didn't just hold their debt now. I held their house, their marinas, their name, and the prison cell with Royce's name already half written on the door. The storm had settled into a thin grey drizzle by the time someone knocked at my apartment 2 evenings later, frantic and uneven. I lived in a modest one-bedroom in a part of the city the Whitfields wouldn't drive through with the doors unlocked. The peeling paint in the stairwell and the radiator that clanked all night were part of the costume too. I sat at a wobbly kitchen table in an oversized sweater, playing the broken, frightened woman who'd lost everything, and I knew exactly who'd be on the other side of that door. It was Bernadette. She pushed in the second I turned the deadbolt, looking absurd in my little kitchen in a camel coat, her diamonds catching the bare bulb. Her face was a careful mask of grief, mascara smudged just so, a leather folder clutched to her chest. Tamsin, you have to help us, she gasped, voice trembling with award-worthy panic. It's Gerald. He collapsed this morning. His heart. He's in the cardiac unit at Toronto General. The doctors don't think he'll last the night. I kept my face blank and closed the door. I knew for a fact Gerald was in perfect health. My security team had pinged his location 20 minutes earlier. He was halfway through a porterhouse at his club downtown. There was no hospital, no failing heart. There was only a desperate woman trying to weaponize a daughter-in-law's guilt one last time. What do you want me to do? I asked, letting my voice shake a little to give her hope. She set the folder on the table and opened it like she was offering me salvation. Power of attorney over Gerald's affairs, the company, everything, in the event of his incapacity. He'd want family making decisions if he can't, she said, sliding the gold pen across to me. Just sign here and here. We can settle the lawsuit too, make it all disappear. We're family, Tamsin. At the end of the day, that's all we are. I looked at the documents. They weren't about a dying man. They were a last grab at control, an attempt to get my signature on something, anything that they could twist. I picked up the pen. Bernadette leaned forward, breathless. I set it back down. No, I said. And tell Gerald to enjoy his steak. Her mask cracked. For one honest second, I saw the panic underneath, the real kind, before she snatched the folder up and called me an ungrateful, scheming little nothing and slammed out of my apartment. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the drizzle on the window and waited for Monday, because Monday was when their world came due. The hearing was downtown, a federal matter folded into the receivership proceedings my company had quietly filed on Whitfield Marine the previous week. The family had no idea those proceedings even existed. They thought they were coming to watch me get crushed over the theft claim. I walked into that courtroom in a plain charcoal suit, no lawyer beside me, and took the seat at the respondent's table alone. Gerald saw me sitting there with no counsel and laughed, that same big laugh from the deck. She can't even afford a lawyer, he announced to the gallery. I told you, nothing. Roy smirked beside him. Coralie crossed her legs and examined her nails. The judge looked down over her glasses, and her face was very serious. Mr. Whitfield, she said, Miss Mider, Whitfield won't be requiring counsel today. Across the aisle, the Whitfields' lead lawyer, a silver-haired litigator who billed more an hour than most people make in a week, had been reading the filing the clerk handed him. He stopped reading. He looked up at me, then down at the platinum brooch on my lapel, the small cedar mark, and the color ran straight out of his face. His briefcase slid off his lap and hit the floor with a crack. My God, he said, barely a breath. It's her. She's Cedar Hollow Capital. She's the creditor. He turned to Gerald, and his voice came out hoarse. Gerald, the fund that bought your debt. She owns it. She owns all of it. Gerald stopped laughing. Beside him, Royce had gone the color of paper, and his hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. What happened over the next 40 minutes I will remember on my deathbed. My counsel of record entered, the call on the debt was confirmed valid, and the misconduct trigger I'd written into those 11 pages clicked into place with all the mercy of a bear trap. The forensic accountants my firm had retained walked the court line by line through 2 years of Royce's embezzlement, money he'd routed through 3 shell vendors to cover gambling debts and a condo in Yorkville his wife didn't know about. Coralie made a small wounded sound at that part. Whitfield Marine was placed into receivership on the spot. The theft claim against me was dismissed as the retaliatory fiction it was, with a note from the bench about wasting the court's time. And the RCMP, who'd been quietly briefed weeks before, were waiting in the hall. I watched them put the cuffs on Royce. The golden boy, the untouchable prince of the Whitfield dynasty, folded forward in his chair and began to weep. Loud, ugly, gulping sobs, rocking in the steel cuffs while the cameras outside the courtroom door flashed through the glass. Gerald said nothing at all. He stared at the table like the wood might tell him how it had all come apart in a single morning, an old man who'd finally been told no by the world. 7 days later, the August heat had turned to a thin September chill, and I sat in the back of a quiet car, parked at the end of the long gravel drive on Lake Joseph. A line of moving trucks filled the circular driveway. The iron gates that had once been kept shut to people like me stood chained wide open. Men with clipboards moved in and out through the timber-framed doors, carrying out the imported furniture, the crated chandeliers, the reclaimed barn board that Coralie had been so worried I'd drip on. A flatbed dragged the vintage Reaver up out of the boathouse on chains. The whole place was being stripped to the studs, a financial autopsy in broad daylight. At the edge of the property, out on the public road, stood the last 2 of them. Corley had a coat that didn't fit and a garbage bag of belongings, looking up and down the empty road for one of her society friends to pull over and rescue her. No one would. The Whitfield name was poison now, and everyone in their old circle knew that handing them so much as a coffee was financial suicide. Bernadette stood beside her, hair whipping loose in the wind of the lake, clutching a single bag the receivers had allowed her to keep. A year ago, even a week ago, I might have thought I'd feel something watching this. Triumph. Some hot, sweet rush of getting even. I might have rolled down the window and said one last devastating thing to finish it. But sitting there in the warm quiet of the car, I understood the truest thing I've ever learned. I felt nothing. No rage, no grief for the family I'd lost because they had never really existed. No pity for the 2 women shivering on the road. They were a bad debt, finally collected, and the ledger was balanced. The account was closed. I looked at them one last time, and I saw strangers who'd made some catastrophic choices. Then I pressed the button on the door, and the privacy shades slid up and covered the window, erasing them from view the same clean way they'd once locked me out in the rain. My driver caught my eye in the mirror waiting. "There's a marina group in Halifax that's about to go under," I said. "Let's go take a look." The car pulled away from the curb, smooth and unhurried, and left the ruins of that family behind on the cold lakeside road. "Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything. Blood doesn't entitle anyone to your respect, your loyalty, or your future. We're told family is everything, that we forgive and forget no matter how deep the cut. But when the people who were supposed to protect you become the ones working hardest to destroy you, walking away isn't betrayal, it's survival. You don't owe anyone the broken version of yourself they prefer to remember. Stop explaining. Stop begging to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. Go quietly build your own life in the dark, and when you finally stand in front of them again, you won't be the frightened girl on her knees in the wine. You'll be something they can't touch. And the real victory won't be watching their world come down. It'll be looking at the people who once made you feel like nothing and feeling nothing at all. If you've ever had to walk away from people you were supposed to be able to trust, and you built something of your own out of the wreckage, tell me about it down in the comments. Unsubscribe if you'd like to stick around with the rest of us who turned the hurt into something quieter and a great deal stronger. For a long time, I believed the cruelty in that family was bad luck, something that had landed on me by accident. It wasn't. Nothing in that courtroom happened by chance. Gerald spent 30 years teaching everyone around him that money was the only thing that made a person real, and Royce learned the lesson too well, learned it so deeply that he started stealing from the very company that raised him, certain his name would always protect him. The shaking I saw in his hands the day the cuffs went on wasn't bad luck either. It was the bill coming due for 2 years of quiet choices nobody made him make. Corley shivering on that road with a garbage bag of belongings, Bernadette waiting for a rescue that never came. All of it grew straight out of seeds they'd planted themselves. Cause and effect. I just stopped standing in the way of it. What carried me through wasn't anger, though I had plenty of that. It was three things I'd been quietly building while they laughed at my little car. The first was a refusal to become them. I could have forged a signature, leaked something ugly, played dirty the way they did. I didn't, because a win you have to lie to keep isn't a win, it's just a new cage. I wanted to be able to look at what I'd done and not flinch, and that mattered more than speed. The second was knowing how the world actually works. I spent years learning balance sheets and lending terms and the 11 boring pages of a credit agreement that nobody else bothered to read. The Whitfields mistook my patience for weakness, but understanding the rules is its own kind of power, and it's the kind nobody can spill wine on or freeze out of a bank account. Coralie thought beauty and a loud voice were enough. They never are. The third was the plain stubbornness to keep going when there was no audience and no applause. There were years in that shabby office when the disguise felt like the truth, when I wondered if I'd ever climb out. I kept showing up anyway. Walking down that gravel drive in the rain, soaked and shaking, I made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with refusing to break. If you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Be someone you don't have to apologize for, even when no one's watching. Learn how things really work instead of how you wish they worked. And when it's dark and quiet and there's no one clapping, get up anyway. The people who hurt you are writing their own ending with every choice they make. Your only job is to build a life so solid and so honest that when you finally see them again, you can look right at them, the ones who swore you were nothing, and feel the cleanest, quietest nothing at all.